Do I have to do more than turn a switch? Oh, there it is. Okay. That was magic. Is that okay? A little louder? I could put it right in my beard, but then all you're going to hear is the rustling of my beard. So, how is that? Who's controlling this? Okay. I mean, I can speak. Is it louder? Is that okay? Can you hear Luke? Okay. Well, I was just counting. It's been 5 months since we were together. Middle of May, June, July, August, September, October. 5 months. Wow, long time. Good to see you all back, masked or not. This time away for me was, I don't know the adjective, particularly removed. I had 5 weeks, more than 5 weeks, 6 weeks. 6 weeks of total solitude in Maine. There wasn't another person there at all. And not even the dog at the beginning. The dog, yeah, I know, that was sad for the dog. The dog finally was able to make it up the last week and a half or so. But that was the only companionship I had that moved around on legs and things. So basically I was talking to the trees and the clouds and the water and the loons and the geese and so forth. But I haven't had that much time, complete solitude, away from everything for such a long time that I can remember. And it was quite amazing. Recentering. There wasn't any loneliness whatsoever, no missing of anything. Literally, there is a clock in the cabin, but it runs on a battery, and so the battery is all rusted and corroded, and I just left it. I didn't replace the battery. So it's always the same time, which I thought was kind of interesting dharmically. No matter when I looked at that clock, it was always the same time. So basically, I went with the sunrise, sunset, and the weather is sort of what I steered by. I did do some reading and a little bit of writing, but mostly I just lost myself in the noisy quiet of the Maine wilderness. So it's been relatively hard coming back and this is my first time doing this lecture, so you're going to have to excuse me if this is a little rough and rusty tonight. Fortunately, I have the Avatamsaka text to steer by. Sit up here and hear me babble too much. But I would say, even for me who's led a monastic life and so forth, a deep immersion in solitude is a very, very precious thing, and something, if you have the chance, grab it. Don't put it off. If you can get an opportunity to do that. Any event. Tonight, we're going back into chapter 9 of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And I'm going to overlap a little bit from last time. I actually had to write Ken and Locke today and ask him where we left off, and I think I have where we left off in middle of May. And we're going to pick up here. This is a chapter called, some people translate as light enlightenment, or I've retranslated as luminous awakening. And we're close to the end of this chapter, so guaranteed this semester we'll move on to chapter 10. And the reason I said, again, to repeat why we started right in the middle of the text with chapter 9 was this is the text and the place where Heng Sure and I entered the text on our bowing pilgrimage. So this is the one that we were using directly, and it was this chapter that was the beginning. If you have copies of this, you don't, I'm going to then read it. There are copies, I think, available if you wanted to look at it. Do we in fact have copies here? Who would any, I'm doing 2 verses tonight, so if somebody wants, somebody wants to look at, sorry, somebody wants to look at the text. The other reason I'm doing this is because my Chinese is terrible, so if somebody reads along with me and my voice isn't quite as strong, it actually sounds decent. So in my text, I'm looking at about page 60 in the online version. Do you have this log that you can tell people it's basically living beings become attached to a self? Yes. Okay. 60 and 61. If you get bored with my talking about it, the thing about having the text is you can read ahead or read back and look at what came previously to get a context. I got page 60, 61. It might not be identical. It's about the 4th verse in this section. Let's see. It starts with cultivated, profuse, great, bitter practices, and living beings flow and turn. And then in the world, attached to the 5 desires. And then this verse tonight. So I tried the Chinese. 众生教我入生死，求其变即不可得。不是如来或妙法，未必宣说是其心。And then the next verse, hopefully get to tonight. 众生无乎病所缠，常论一处去三毒，大火蒙眼红烧日，精心度比是其心。So although I talked a little bit about this the last time, I want to maybe just overlap a bit and say a few more things, because this is one of those key concepts in Buddhism or in the Dharma that is particularly hard for all of us to sort of wrap our heads around, this idea of the self or no self, anatta. So the text says living beings become attached to a self and enter birth and death. They seek its boundaries but cannot obtain it. We should wholeheartedly serve thus come one. And then the text is literally, and obtain the wonderful Dharma, expounding it to others is his practice. I've actually, in my text here, I put a single quotation mark next to the word self. So living beings become attached to a self, not become attached to themselves, but to a self, and that's a very different rendering. If you say they become attached to themselves, that's talking about their persons, their beings. But what's being talked about here is a notion of self, which is actually an imagined construction. It doesn't really exist. We'll go into this a little more. And when it says they seek for bounties but cannot obtain it, one way of looking at this is this idea of a permanent, unchanging self or being. When you look for where that begins and where it ends, it's very hard to get at. Now, it doesn't just mean that the beginning is obscure, where we come from, but also where we go after the passing of this body, so to speak. These are two boundaries, but they're hard to fix. They're hard to say, this is where it all begins, this is where it all ends. Because the question arises, before you're born, what is that? Or where is that? Or who is that? And after one seemingly dies, whatever that is, it's another transformation. And so it's not necessarily an end name, but a change. The boundaries of this, but also compared to the boundaries of we take to be the physical body, if we say this is me in a very material sense, where are the boundaries of that? The earth elements, the ligaments, the tendons, the bones are constantly changing, growing. In my case, they're declining, shrinking. The breath, the air, the heat, the water, the fluids, all of these things are constantly interchanging with the larger world. It's not like there's a fixed boundary. We're not hermetically sealed autonomous entities, but rather we're osmotically connected. That's why you're wearing masks tonight, because the boundary between your air and your living beings and your viruses and bacteria are constantly interchanging and going through this room, and for all beings in the world, this is happening all the time. So this matter and energy transfer is without end and without boundary. This is one of the, I wouldn't say the discoveries, but one of the major points of the environmental movement is that you cannot isolate earth, air, fire, and water from each other. They move across boundaries, across regions, across cultures, and that is the nature of reality, is this intermixing, interdependent fluidity of all things. So to say there is a fixed, separate entity called a self in this is really not scientifically valid. It's not how things are described scientifically. And the text is maintaining here psychologically, it's also not valid. These don't have boundaries. And then it says we should wholeheartedly serve the thus come one. This is very interesting. Because the question would arise, how does one serve a thus come one? How does one serve a Buddha? Where would you find a Buddha to serve? What does that mean? I mean, it's an interesting question. I could throw it out to everybody here and say, okay, we hear this line, wholeheartedly serve a thus come one, and presume that this is going to happen at some other time when we meet a thus come one, and then we can maybe serve. But in the absence of a thus come one here and now, or one that we would even recognize, what does that mean? Is this then only applying to another time, another place, or only applying to, say, bodhisattvas who seem to exist in a realm where they have access to immediately to thus come ones? We see this throughout the text, that they draw near to, they respect, they worship, they serve, and so forth. So anybody want to jump in on this, that kind of difficult question? What does it mean to serve a thus come one? And I use rather than, than the thus come one. Thus come one limits it to one being, which is almost monotheistic if you think about it. But in this teaching, since all beings have the thus come one nature and all beings can become thus come ones, then assuming that this has been going on for a while, would be innumerable, maybe measureless thus come ones in different worlds at same time and so forth. Anybody want to jump in, try it? Since this doesn't give you a grade for this class, and you don't need it to get into graduate school, you can kind of jump in and try your heart at this. Yeah, go ahead.
Without the teachings, maybe?
The teachings?
Yeah.
So one way of saying this is you serve the teachings, and you're not too far off because the Buddha said that in fact part of the Dharma body of a Buddha is the actual teachings that go on from generation to generation. But how would you serve the teachings? Okay, so then you go to the next level. Cultivating according to the teachings is in fact one of the ways of serving a thus come one. Now, whether you came up with that or remember that, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. It's out there now. Okay, anybody else want to jump in on that? Yeah. So single-mindedly cultivating, in a sense, basically doing the three non-outflows, Shila, Samadhi, Prajna, precepts, concentrated equanimity practices, and then the corresponding insights. The developing yourself in that way is in service to a thus come one. Yeah, in fact, it would seem that the first start of a thus come one is to really take the mind ground teachings, which is that is one's inherent nature. This is a premise. I mean, I would say if you accept the premise that this thus come one, a Buddha, that is the inherent nature of any living being, including people, then to be in service of that is to nurture and support that. And it's basically to develop and cherish your own spiritual nature. So in a sense, that's the first base of serving a thus come one, is to take what's called the thus come one within and cultivate, nurture, support, sort of feed it in a sense, and let it grow almost as you would raise an embryo to a child to a fully resplendent person. You develop and nurture that being, that your internal. So that could be the first.
The thus come one could be interpreted as the truth that is already present, which is the inherent nature.
Yeah, right. So it means really getting in touch with your best, not only the best person you could possibly be, but even getting in touch with that sort of dormant potential to be much more than we allow ourselves to believe we can be. And it's interesting that it only comes about through this, not through belief alone. There has to be a trust or confidence that that's there. If the initial trust is not there in that nature, then you'll just fall into doubts and a kind of nihilistic abandon. You won't really pick it up. And the first obstacle one meets, you just pull back from it. But the first element of faith in this teaching is faith in oneself. And then faith in the teachings, and then faith in the teachers that bring that along. But without the faith in yourself with that potential, you would say, well, I'm not capable, I'm inherently flawed, or I'm capable but nobody else is, so, whatever you go. But that is an element of faith almost. I would use trust or confidence that one starts with, that is something. It's almost this feeling you have, this incompleteness, this longing for something greater, or more meaningful or brighter than we are currently. And that impulse, that little bit of longing, is actually the beginning or the manifestation of the thus come one. It doesn't manifest, as a full-blown Buddha with all these powers and whatnot. It's often a very quiet voice, a longing, almost an inclination that you're not quite sure about. It's a beginning of something. Maybe in the quietest moments of your morning or at night, or when you first wake up, there's this tendency or inclination or spark, if you will, that this could be a lot better than it is, and I could get beyond a lot of things that are impeding me and I'm laying out there that afflict others and so forth. That is actually I would say the chi of a thus come one. That's the energy of a thus come one. Bringing it to fruition takes time and practice, depending on how many snarls and tangles we've set up in between, but that's the motivation, that's what gets it going. So instead of seeing it, and this is really a good point, as something accomplished, a done deal, you see it as a work in progress, which makes a great deal of difference. So like, it's almost like a thus come one you see as this raw stone that is potentially a jade, and it has to be rubbed and polished and smoothed before the luminescent qualities come out. So you see the thus come one as this diamond in the rough, so to speak, if you want to use that language of your own nature. So that's pretty cool. But it makes it much more organic and applicable rather than a thus come one, and I'll do that when I meet one. It's like, good luck. There's a section in chapter 40 of the Avatamsaka Sutra that I really like that breaks down the duality between a thus come one and me, or a thus come one and all living beings. I'll just read the one part of it. If an enlightened being, a bodhisattva, one who sees things as they really are, accords with living beings, gets along with and meets the potentials of living beings, then he or she accords with and makes offerings and serves all Buddhas. If he can honor and serve all living beings, then he or she honors and serves the thus come ones. If he makes living beings happy, he or she is making all thus come ones happy. So here, this wonderful chapter, this is chapter 40 of the Avatamsaka, sometimes a separate text, as chapter 39 is, and sometimes just included in all. The version that we're using here has chapter 40 as just a separate chapter. But it's really the vows of Samantabhadra of Universal Worthy Bodhisattva. It's a wonderful chapter. But that chapter there is basically making the thus come one an equal to all living beings. And right away you can see the challenge. Because if you're going to work with yourself as a potential thus come one, that's pretty daunting, if we're really honest, on a good day. But when you start to think all living beings also have this potential, and that by getting along with, by serving, by bringing out their spiritual nature, by helping and supporting, making them happy, not entertaining them, but making them really happy, figuring out what that means, that is to actually serve a thus come one. So that's very immediate. Anyhow, I'm going to change to this line here. It says, and obtain the wonderful Dharma. So what's interesting about this passage, I want to maybe unpack it a little bit, but you got the first part. Living beings become attached to a self, enter birth and death, which is an interesting phrase. They seek the boundaries and can't obtain it. This sounds like a bummer, okay? So this is definitely, birth and death is not presented here as a circus, as a carnival. This is a kind of unhappy state. You're born only to die, and you have a short interval in between, and you don't have much time to make sense of what that interval's about, because you have to get through kindergarten, then get to advanced elementary school. From an advanced elementary school, you have to get into one of prestigious high schools, and of course you want to get into a prestigious university so you can get a good job, which are hard to find. And if you get a good job, you'll probably lose it, so you have to change job 20 times in your lifetime, and by the time you're 60 or 75, maybe you take a breath and you realize, heck, I just got terminal cancer. It's all over. So, it's like, okay, so this birth and death thing is very existential. It's very real. It's not like I'm born, I have a wonderful time in between, I go to Disneyland, and then I go off to rebirth in a heaven. It's very elusive, and the boundaries are very hard to attain, but it's not presented here as a great state. Then it says boundaries can update. You seek, but you can't get it. So the next phase is, it's not a satisfactory type of situation, because no matter how desperately and cravingly you want and seek some solution to this, it's always elusive. It's always, that's the suffering. You're apart from those things that you really love and cherish. Either you're apart from them because you've been separated from them, or you're apart from them because they've been taken away, or you're apart from them because you can't really get your life together to get close to them. So you're apart from those things you want and love and cherish. You're separated from those. You're apart from those, and you're then close to things that you don't want to be close to. And that's the other, in a suffering and mode. So you can't be with what makes you happy, or who makes you happy, or the job that makes you happy, or the country that makes you happy, or the politicians that make you happy, or the purchases that make you, whatever you think is going to make you happy. You can't get it. So you're apart from those things. And then you're close to the things that you don't want. The people you really don't want to be with, the job you don't want to be with, the books you don't want to read. It's like on and on. The contracts you sign that you'd like to get out of, IRS, whatever it is, you're close to that which you don't like. And it could be interpreted both socially and psychologically. So this dukkha is not just about, I can't be near the people I love. I'm only close to those people I don't care about. Kurt Vonnegut called this a granophalloon. And Kurt Vonnegut's here, being together with a bunch of people we have nothing in common with and actually alienated from, which you can't get out of, we call a granophalloon. The opposite was a karass, which was very rare. That was being with people you really loved. Anyhow, I'm digressing. I like Vonnegut. So if you haven't read Kurt Vonnegut, you definitely check him out. He's not a Buddhist necessarily. But then that could be, I don't like myself. And so I'm with something. I'm with a version of myself. I'm with a reification of myself that really makes me unhappy. I don't want to be with myself. And so you get this dissociated state that you're with yourself, but you're not content. You're not really in the harmony and integrity of your own being. There's always this kind of out-attunement with yourself. And it can lead to a kind of despair or an anxiety or a hyperness that you're kind of running away from yourself, being busy, 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 because if you sit down, listen to yourself, this is sort of I was going to say modern, but I think you can read back in ancient literature and you can find this malaise is in the human condition. So then there is the suffering of never getting what you seek. So these are the three last sufferings: being apart from those that you care about, being close to ones you don't want, and then never getting what you seek. So this is one of the terms for dukkha, and there you have it. They seek but can't obtain. On the last line, the way I wanted to retranslate this is, and obtain the wonderful Dharma. So what's interesting, it's saying, on the first part, you have these two kind of disappointing lines. Birth and death, attachment to a self, and then not getting the boundaries, not getting any satisfaction from that. Now you have this word here, this wonderful Dharma, miaofa. I think that's what it is in Chinese. Let me look back. Is it miaofa? Yeah, miaofa. Okay, thank you. So this miao is like sublime, wondrous, really satisfying in a very deep, almost unconditioned way. It doesn't come or go. It's just a fullness of joy. And then it says obtain the wonderful Dharma. I wouldn't translate obtain here. The word is huo, if you look at the Chinese. And it does mean to obtain. It also means to catch. But I like the better meaning of it. It has to do with to reap or to harvest. And I think that works better as what happens and obtain the wonderful Dharma, is because if we're talking about the internal and the development of the internal, the work on that ground that's given to you to till, your nature, the work on that then produces fruit, harvest. It's not you obtain it, but you actually cultivate it, and it is the fruit or the growth of that development. So it's almost like it's just blossoming from within. And so that's why I would use huo to reap or to harvest something. And then the next dimension was very interesting, expounding to others is his practice. So once you go through this process, or while you're going through this process, you're also sharing it. Now the thing is, the reality is, if you're not going through this process, and you're really just going deeper and deeper into the tunnel, whatever you want to call that, of birth and death and whatnot, you're sharing that with others. Sorry. You cannot not share it with others because of the very nature of the interdependency of all of us. We are at all times sharing. You don't have a choice. It's just what you share is the difference. If you're in this, then you are naturally expounding it in a way by embodying it for others. So even if you don't talk, you don't write, the very nature that you got into this zone of fruition and harvest and nurturing shows. I mean, the text says it shows even from behind. You can see it in someone's shoulder and their stance. There's a vibe. I don't want to use aura. I'm getting a little, maybe a little far out for myself even. There's an energy, a field, a coloring, the text say, that shows even in the skin from behind. This is the sharing. So if it's not genuine, you're sharing its opposite, but thinking you're sharing the joy, and you're not. So anyhow, so a little bit more on this. The entering birth and death seems really strange, but it necessarily follows from the inevitability of trying to find a permanent, unchanging, immutable, isolated self, which cannot be found. It does not exist. But wanting to get that, wanting to hold something permanent, where the very nature of reality is impermanent, that leads to the birth and death, the toggle switch. Since you sent me a poem, you were in New Hampshire and went to Robert Frost's farm. He wasn't there anymore, I take it? Yeah, his aura was there. This is very close to where I spend the summer. In any event, he's one of my favorite accessible poets. But he gives a poem along these lines. And because I love poetry, and I always find these connections with Western thought and literature with this material, I always try to sort of bring it in a little bit. So this is, actually, the poem is titled "Nothing Gold Can Stay." And it's a poet's reflection. He's not Buddhist, but he's reflecting on the absolute reality of when you seek what you can't obtain, it's a form of suffering. And yet, in our condition, we continue to do this again and again and again. And so he writes about this with a sort of, I'm telling you how it is, but I'm a little sad it's that way too. And here's the poem. Locke suggested I drop the screen and show the poem up here for you to see, but that screen is, I don't know. I'm very old-fashioned because I don't like all this technology. Sorry, guys. I'm really smitten with AI, by the way, you can tell. So I'm going to read the poem slowly. And I pity the translator. Someone's translating this to Chinese, and I don't know how you're going to do it. But even if I read it slowly in English, it's going to be hard to translate. Okay, so here's the poem. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. So unpack it a little bit, because you don't have the words, you can't look at it. Nature's first gold is green. Nature's first green is gold? No, nature's first green is gold. What does that mean? Anybody? Yeah, see, what these poems do for me too is like it brings you back brings me back, and hopefully you guys, into more closeness with nature, which is sadly at a remote place in most of our lives these days. So anybody? Nature's first green is gold? What does that mean?
That's a wonderful thing.
True, but it's a color. If you watch in the early spring, when the things that are green come up, they kind of got a yellowish golden green about them. It's a wonderful early green. To me, it's one of my favorite colors. And it says the hardest hue to hold. It can't hold that because it starts to turn into a deep green. And then he goes on, he says, early leaves a flower, but only for an hour. So again, you see, when I'm up in Maine, there's a flowering, and within a few days, all of a sudden the flower is gone. Right now, leaf subsides to leaf. And people go up there to observe that phenomena. Almost it's really weird because the leaves are dying and falling, but people go up and celebrate this. But they're celebrating the color, they're not celebrating the dying of the leaves, I don't think. It's hard to imagine tourists going to a funeral for fun, but heck. And he says, so Eden sank to grief. In other words, the Garden of Paradise also declined and fell. And then he says, so dawn goes down to day. The dawn goes down to day, day goes down to night. Nothing gold can stay. So this is Robert Frost talking about the just built-in impermanence. So therefore you get this idea from the poem, from the verse here, you seek but you can't obtain. And this is one of the dukkhas, one of the primary forms of dukkha. Also, it's avidya. It's hard to translate avidya. I mean, people translate it as ignorance, but that's a little judgmental. It literally means not seeing things, not seeing clearly. And then you get into what I'm trying to do with these poets and whatnot is get a little bit into the psychology behind the Avatamsaka verse here, because it's so terse, of how the reality of impermanence is there, and yet all different ways we turn and twist to avoid, to deny, to pretend it's not true. And our whole lives get caught up in what's called the entering of the samsaric existence, going on and on and on, looping, so to speak, both immediately and from life to life because of this attachment. So it's, this is attributed to Einstein. Whether he actually said it or not, I don't know, but it's attributed to Einstein. He says insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So this would be a definition of samsaric existence, or thinking the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, patterning the same things over and over again, expecting different results. So what the first two lines of the verse is saying, you seek but you can't obtain. Did you change your seeking strategy? Absolutely not. You just keep seeking. You keep seeking. And no matter what you get, strangely, it doesn't satisfy the itch. And so another kind of suffering comes in, you get what you seek. But what you get is not what you really want or need. And so quickly you jettison that. And so this thing becomes a habitual pattern, doing the same thing and expecting different results when it just keeps coming back. So there's two poets that I wanted to share too again tonight that talk about this. The one again is Frost, but before I come to Frost, I go back to one poet called Dylan Thomas. And Dylan Thomas died young, probably died of tuberculosis, which they call consumption. Was very much a poetic death. A lot of poets die of consumption for some reason. Irish, English, Scottish poets who are making a living not by their poetry, but by just barely surviving, probably pick up tuberculosis pretty easily. His poem, he talks about dying. He says, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So confronting impermanence, confronting mortality, his thing is rage against it, fight it, resist it. But again, although this is what we try to do, again, it's obtaining what we can't seek, because no matter how you fight and rage against it, it comes. And I'm feeling this very much more in the last 10 years now, where person after person that I've been close to, my teachers, my friends, my family, are like the leaves. They're just falling. Every call, every email that comes in, it's about something. I'm the last member of my family, really, of a large family over time. That just, and here I am reflecting on it and thinking, well, I'm glad I made it, and I will be the survivor. No, as they went, so am I going. So this realization of rage against, no matter how much you rage, no matter how much you fight, you can't beat this. It's like Las Vegas. The house has the odds. The house always wins. And this is the case here. So Dylan Thomas, young, writing this, maybe because he's young and his own death is coming, he says, rage again. It doesn't matter. And he says, and he hopes, and he says, and death shall have no dominion. Death will not rule over us. No matter, but, I mean, all of you, really? I mean, do I have to say this? You know? Deep, not even deep in your heart, you know it in your skin. Just watch your skin, you know? Look at the wrinkles. I was sitting on the dock in Maine, and I looked down at that brilliant sunlight and said, huh, what happened there? That used to be a bulging muscle. And now it looks like a piece of old tofu, and there's wrinkles where that nice skin used to be. And I'm like, okay, rage against, no, it's not gonna work. So I read a poem by Frost. Gosh, the time goes by so fast. Am I gonna get to this next chapter? I don't know. But I love the poetry, and it works, so this poem is a poem. Also, I had to memorize this kind of stuff when I was in elementary school and high school. I don't think they do that anymore. You just Google stuff, and now pretty soon you can have an Encyclopedia Britannica down, actually implanted behind your ear, so you don't even have to. I mean, you can just ask. Oh, I'm serious. It's already there. But the nuns made me memorize a lot of this stuff. This poem, though, I really like. It's called Reluctance, and again, it's Frost, and maybe that's where we end up tonight. We'll move on. But in this poem, and these poets that write about this, it's really interesting. Even Shakespeare in his sonnets, they get right at dukkha. They get at the Buddhist concept of dukkha really well. I mean, almost in lyrical phrases and turns of phrase that really stir us. And then there's this impasse they reach. There's no way out. They don't have a way out except to lament or to poignantly, almost with remorse, point it out to us. But then there isn't like the last two lines, and that's what I wanted to get to. I'll get to it next week. Why is there this turn from this inevitability of mortality and death and impermanence to then this wondrous joy? How do you get there? Because it's not necessarily where the poets go. So here, I'll read you Frost. And I relate to this because this is what I do in Maine. Out through the fields and the woods, and over the walls I have wandered. And of course in Maine, the easiest way to make a fence is with rocks and stones. You see this all the time. There's so many rocks and stones from the post-glacial period that farmers, in order to clear their fields and plant things, have to move these stones. Well, where are they going to put them? They make walls out of them. So, over these I have wended. I have climbed the hills of view and looked at the world and descended. I've come by the highway home, and lo, it is ended. Next verse. The leaves are all dead on the ground, except those that the oak is keeping. This is a wonderful image. To ravel them one by one and let them go scraping and creeping out over the crusted snow where others are sleeping. So at this point in Maine, if I were to go there, the frost would be on the ground, maybe the first snow, but the leaves, the dry leaves, would be tumbling and rolling along, and some still hanging on the tree. So where others are sleeping, these still keep rolling. And the dead leaves lie huddled and still, no longer blown hither and thither. The lost lawn aster is gone, the long lost flower is gone. and the flowers of the witch hazel wither. And then he turns from the observation of nature, the passing of things, and then he goes inside. And this is wonderful. The heart is still aching to seek, to obtain, but the feet question whither. So he's older now, but maybe a little wiser, and he says, the heart still wants to seek, wants to get beyond this, and the feet question whither, where are we going to go exactly? And so now the dilemma, the dominion is coming in, the Lord is of more impermanence is here, and where exactly are your feet going to take you? And then this last line that I really love, he says. That's what the last line is, ah. Poets don't say this like, aha, they go, ah. When to the heart of man was it ever less than a treason to go with the drift of things, to yield with a grace to reason, and bow and accept the end of a love or a season? So this last line, when to the heart of man, to the deep hardcore of man, was it ever less than a treason, a revolt, or a rebellion to go against the drift of things? Just go over the drift of things. And the heart says, no, fight against the raging lion. When was it ever less than a treason to go with the drift of things and yield with the grace to reason, to what is rational and reasonable? No, we insist on posing. And then he says, and bow and accept the end of a love or a season. I would put a third line there. He wouldn't mind. And bow and accept the end of a life, a love, or a season. So this idea he's acknowledging, he's not going where Dylan Thomas is going, he's not fighting and raging, but there's this sadness about it. And yet an inexplicable, we try and we keep doing this, but why can't we just bow and accept? What is it? But he leaves it as a question for us. So I guess that's where I'm going to leave it tonight, because we're out of time on this. I didn't realize this was going to take up so much time, and I'd like to apologize, but I really like reading these poems again. And we'll get back, we'll finish this verse of the text and go on next week to the next part. And what I want to share next week is there's actually some interesting Buddhist scholarship on this term anatta that I want to share with you that's come more of it modern, but as the more modern gets into it and they read these texts more carefully and closely and deeply, they find that our initial understanding of them is actually skewed and not what it was, like nirvana as extinction and anatta as no self and no me. All of these negativity interpretations, in fact, are a problem of translation, a problem of not understanding the text, and a problem of not cultivating them to getting to the point where the opposite occurs, the wondrousness starts to manifest. So some of the scholarship I'll share with you next week on this, and I think you'll find it pretty interesting. But I like to go back, I like to do some scholarship, I like to do some poetry, I like to tell some stories, and of course the text itself. So I have fun doing this. I know it's probably not as much fun for you, but it keeps me coming every Friday night. So anyhow, any quick questions on any of this that you wanted to ask, or intakes or observations? Went to the heart of man, what is it, never less than a treason to go with the drift of things and yield with a grace to reason, and bow and accept the end of a life, a love, or a season. Yeah. Wow. I wish I could write like that. Anybody? Question, comment, observation before we close? Yes.
We like the poetry. It's really nice.
What's that?
Like the poetry.
You don't mind the poetry? Okay, good. Yeah, I do Chinese poems too, and they're great. But then I always get criticized because I pronounce the poet wrong, like Libo, Lipo. But I wanted to show that what we're talking about here is universal. And I very seldom use that word because it gets into sort of a kind of, what's the word they use? Not eternalism. What's the word that's in academia for everything being universal and what is it? No. Huh? Not perennial. There's a word, it's a naughty, bad word. It was told to me once when I said, this seems to be universal to humanity. You know, and it was politically incorrect to say that. I'll think of what it is. But what I pick up here, what I'm gravitate to in my own thinking and reasoning, is there's something in these Chinese poets, these Western sources, these Buddhist texts, different forms. They're all pointing to something quintessentially human that cuts across time and culture. And this is the teaching of humanity. This is not an ism about an Asian religion or a theology or something. What they're doing is they're getting at what really makes us tick, what makes us hurt, what brings us joy and pleasure, what we really confront. Sometimes the language is a little stilted, but if you find these other sources and they mutually shed light on each other, you're getting a sort of almost like Indra's net of mirrors and reflecting each other. And when you find these elements, you realize that great deep hearts and minds have been talking about this for a long time. And we're doing one particular take on it with the Avatamsaka. But the Avatamsaka is such that its threads go out to touch a poet like Robert Frost or Dylan Thomas. It includes them in its compass. And if we come at it that way, back and forth, the East-West, the Asian, American, all this sort of stuff just dissolves, and we're back to the human mind, the human heart again, which is the ground of where these texts are supposedly taking us. So that's why I always like to bring this in. It's also the idea in the Avatamsaka of connecting principles with specifics, concrete with abstract, your own life with these teachings. So if I read one of these poems tonight, and something resonates with you, you've been to a funeral or you've been on a walk, and you've just for a moment saw a leaf fall or a star come out of the universe, a shooting star, and you go, whoa, impermanence. And why do I think that I'm different than that star, or the, da-da-da, and you start, that brings you back into the ground of these teachings. So we'll continue to do this on Friday night. Good to be back, good to see you. Okay, anything else? No announcements. Jin Chuan and Jin Hui are somewhere off in Europe. I'm not sure where. Poland, France. Anybody know where they are? Where are they, Luke? You don't know. They left here, Luke, to watch the door, and he doesn't know when. You know when they're coming back? You may be here for the rest of your life. Well, did they go as a delegation? You don't know that either. Okay. Anybody else? Ken, do you know where they are or what they're doing?
Well, last week, 2 days ago, we were in England. I don't know where they are. So I think they're going to do it.
That reminds me of that folk song. Oh, I've never been to England, but I've been to Oklahoma. Okay, so they were in England. They were watching the WASC accreditation thing together, I guess from England.
They were in Poland. I saw a picture of Bialystok.
Of what?
He was they were in Bialystok.
He was in Poland then?
Yeah.
And then they're in France because they're setting up a new monastery or something in France. And I, with all due respect, and my dear friend Paul is French, but good luck. Sorry. I know from my conversations for the French to get Bianduca. Never mind, I won't go there. And then Heng Sure is back in Australia, but I think he's doing tomorrow night online, the Avatamsaka, and I think he's been doing another sutra in the afternoon. Saturday afternoon? Friday. Yeah. Okay, so he's zooming in from Australia. Our other monks are in Asia. I'm here in Berkeley. Who else is? That's usually what we do, right? There wouldn't be any Great Compassion repentance or thing tomorrow on Saturday because nobody's here, correct? Do you know any more, Locke? Wow, we've entered true emptiness here. Okay, with that, let's share it with others. Do the transference. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.